Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined this evening by two excellent guests. Firstly, by the MP for Glasgow North West, Carol Monaghan. Carol, how are you doing this evening?
I'm good, thanks very much.
And on the other side of me, we have Director of Momentous Change, Roger Mullen. Roger, how are you doing?
I'm doing just great, and I'm so happy to be here in a programme with Carol, one of my colleagues from a few years back.
Yeah, we are delighted to have both of you, it should be said. Now, we start this evening, as we always do, with our coronavirus statistics update. And as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 820,986 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 786,226 were confirmed negative, 34,760 were positive. There were 1,054 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today, and sadly, one new reported death. This will, of course, be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will necessarily get tested. As always, we urge you, if you are showing symptoms of a new, dry, persistent cough, a fever, or a change in your sense of taste or smell, then do please book a test as quickly as you can. Of the people who have tested positive, there were 319 people in hospital last night, 28 of whom were in intensive care. And the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 2,533. This number only includes those who have died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures available show that 42,515 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 70 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. And we also have some additional figures from National Records of Scotland for the week ending 4th of October. In that week, a total of 20 deaths linked to the novel coronavirus were registered, an increase of 10 since the previous week. 10 of these deaths had already been reported in the Scottish Government's daily briefings. 13 occurred in hospitals, 6 in care homes, and 1 in another institutional setting. This takes the total number of deaths directly linked to the pandemic in Scotland to 4,276. The Scottish Government also published some scientific analysis today by the Chief Medical Officer, Chief Nursing Officer, and the National Clinical Director. It highlights that the R number in Scotland is now between 1.3 and 1.7, meaning that on average, each infected person infects between 0.3 and 0.7 others. This means that total confirmed cases are now doubling across the country roughly every 9 days. This is the highest transmission rate in the UK right now, meaning the pandemic is growing faster in Scotland than in the other UK nations. However, Scotland is starting from a significantly lower level of cases than England, which has seen around 14,000 new cases each day for the past few days. And just before we go on to the rest of tonight's news, if you'd like to join the conversation here on Scotland at 7, you can do so by following us on Twitter at BroadcastScot and using the hashtag Scotland at 7. That's hashtag ScotlandAT and the number 7. We will, as you can see, be flashing some of those tweets up on the screen as we go through the show. But our first story today, further measures to reduce the spread of coronavirus are to come into effect later this week, as Scotland recorded more than 1,000 new positive test results in a single day. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon told Parliament today that actions are needed now to prevent a return to the peak level of infections experienced in spring before the end of this month. The new restrictions, backed by a new £40 million support fund for business and the existing UK job retention scheme, will be in place nationwide for 16 days, with tighter restrictions across central belt areas where the infection rate is the highest. Restrictions on licensed premises will come into force from 6 o'clock on Friday, the 9th of October, with all other restrictions applying from a minute past midnight on Saturday, the 10th. The new measures include nationwide restrictions on hospitality, including restrictions on the sales of alcohol, with additional restrictions in the Central Belt, which includes Ayrshire and Arran, Forth Valley, Greater Glasgow and Clyde, Lanarkshire and Lothian health boards, where all licensed premises will be required to close. Cafes will have different opening hours, and there will be reductions in gyms and other events. Sorry, Carol, I think if we come to you first on this, clearly a lot of people are not going to be delighted to have these new restrictions imposed, but do you think that this is a proportionate response from the Scottish Government?
Well, many people, including myself and probably Nicola Sturgeon herself as well, this is really difficult. People are frustrated. I think there was great compliance for the first few months. People wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to protect themselves, protect their families, protect those in their communities. But I think there is a sense of fatigue about this now, that people want to start seeing a return to normality. So I can understand the frustration that people are feeling. We're all feeling it, and we're all just wanting this to end. But less is what's required, and many people are saying, well, I'm happy to take the, but we've got to understand it's not about personal risk, and it's about community health and looking after the greater good. And the First Minister, unfortunately, has had to take the steps that she's taken today. I don't think anyone's been surprised by it. Certainly, I know from correspondence I've had from constituents that many people were hoping for this, because people are frustrated that, you know, they can't see their family, but people can go out. So there are people that have been looking for this, but there's also people that are understandably going to be upset by it. And yeah, we get it. We feel the same.
And I mean, you mentioned obviously the kind of differences in levels of compliance. Interestingly, the scientific report that was published today said that levels of compliance seem to have remained pretty stable over the months. And it's perhaps more to do with the way the economy has been opened up that has just created more opportunities for transmission. How confident are you that people will stick to these new restrictions?
Well, in terms of if we're looking at, for example, hospitality settings, then of course people have to stick to them, because that's their licence is going to be involved with that. In terms of, you know, visiting other people's houses, I do sense that people want to still comply. I don't get the feeling that people are wanting to push things. But what I would say is that, you know, lots of things happened from kind of August onwards. We had Eat Out to Help Out scheme from the UK government, which many people, including myself, took advantage of. But that got people out and about and socialising and into settings that they wouldn't have been in up until that point. We also had schools going back. Now, you need to remember that schools went back a month earlier in Scotland, and universities have gone back earlier as well. So it's not a surprise that we see the cases rising in Scotland. We're probably just a couple of weeks ahead of what's happening in England just now, and there's reasons for that. There are lots of people together in these different settings. And ultimately, we need to protect young people going to school. We have to protect workers that are going to work. So we need to look at where are the other interactions with people, and what can we do to limit these interactions. So I understand the frustration. I understand that people are getting towards the end of their tether, but we just need to keep holding out.
And Roger, just to come to you now. We seem to have lost Roger for a minute. So Carol, I'll stay with you. Carol, you are a former teacher yourself. Were you how would you have felt with the way the schools reopened? Do you sympathise with your colleagues having to kind of change everything at relatively short notice to bring kids back after having planned for a more sort of blended learning approach earlier in the year?
Totally. I mean, I'd be daft if I said I didn't sympathise with them. My I've got teachers in my family. Two of my sisters are teachers, so I've heard all the complaints from them. But what I would also say is that all the kind of structures that were developed kind of sort of May, June time, looking at how we were going to get children back into schools in August, we might still need to use them. That's still there as a sort of last resort, as a something we can use to keep education going in a different manner. We don't want a situation where we can't have children in school at all. So although it was a bit frustrating for them to do that work in May, June time, for then things to change, it's kind of the preparation work is already there. The systems have been developed. They've got plans in place if we need to go harder here.
And I believe you have kids yourself. How have they been getting on at school? Have the new kind of ways of doing things at school been easy enough for them to cope with?
Well, I've got three kids. One's in his final year at university, and probably he's the one that's finding it most difficult. I've got two, one in secondary, one in S2 in secondary, and one in primary 7. The one in primary 7 loved lockdown and would quite happily not have gone back to school. But the 13-year-old, she was really struggling. She missed the social contact. She missed being in class. She missed her learning. She thrives on that. So that was really difficult for her. And I saw a real change in her personality. I know a lot of people have talked about the difficulties for young people in their mental health. I definitely saw it with her. She needed to be amongst young people of her own age and not stuck at home with her parents who were annoying her. So it has been difficult. They've loved being back at school. They've loved the freedom of being back at school. Who would have thought we would refer to being back at school as freedom? But they've loved that time away from their parents, doing normal things that kids do and interacting with their peers. So, I mean, the thought of going back into lockdown is kind of filling certainly the 13-year-old with terror. My son at university is finding things tough as well because everything's happening online. There's limited social interaction. That's a tough gig, and I totally get that young people at university are finding this challenging. It is challenging. It's challenging for all of us to be working in the way that we are, but part of university, as we know, a big part of it is the social aspect, and there's the work hard and play hard. If all you're getting is the work hard and you're not getting the play hard, it's quite tough.
Yeah. Well, we will move on now to our next story. The Scottish Parliament today refused to grant legislative consent to the UK Internal Market Bill, with only the Tories arguing in favour of the controversial bill. The Conservative argued that the bill was essential to ensure the stability of trade within the UK once the UK is no longer under EU rules as of January 1st next year. The SNP, Labour, the Greens and the Lib Dems all said that the bill failed to respect the devolution settlement and that it had not been written in consultation with the devolved governments. Several speakers referred to the STU statement we reported last night, which said that if the UK government passed the bill without consent from Holyrood, then the case for a second independence referendum would be unanswerable. Labour in particular pointed out the damage the Conservative and Unionist Party were doing to the stability of the Union with the bill. Speakers also noted that the bill threatens to breach international law, thus lowering the UK's international reputation, while potential breaches of the Good Friday Agreement could scupper chances of a trade agreement with the US, which is said to be a key reason for passing the bill in the first place. The legislative consent motion was defeated by 90 votes to 28. And I believe we do have Roger back now. So Roger, I'll come to you first on this. What did you make of the debate in the Holyrood today? Did you catch any of it?
Well, unfortunately, I was so busy I didn't catch any of it.
Then
Did you report there was anything?
I suppose then the obvious question is, this isn't a shock. What do you expect to happen next?
What I expect to happen next is that the UK government will continue to ignore the devolved institutions, that they'll just try and ram everything through and go ahead. And then the big question comes what the devolved institutions, what Scotland is going to do about it, how they're going to react. So that Carol will perhaps have a different view since she's down in London, but I don't see any sign at all of any conciliatory moves likely to come from Westminster.
And this statement from the STUC that came out last night saying that, pushing this bill through against the will of the devolved governments would make the case for an independence referendum unanswerable. I mean, this is quite a shift from the trade union movement compared to, say, 2014, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And, what I'm finding, as I'm sure many people are, it's not just that institutions, public institutions like that are shifting. I'm certainly finding on the ground that there are individuals shifting, that there are businesses shifting who are very concerned about the future is going to be. So I think all the signs are that on the ground things are moving, and they're moving towards a recognition that, first of all, the UK government is incompetent in a manner that nobody predicted or expected to happen. And that is loosening, is it like, if you like, the chains. And then people are thinking, but is there an alternative? And I think what they're beginning to look at now is not only are the chains loosening, but we're beginning to see Scotland not to be caught permanently in this rudderless mess, and indeed to try and create a much better future. So I think things are in a unusual kind of way. We're beginning to be led by the future, or how people are perceiving the future, rather than simply relying on the way in which people analysed the past.
Now, Carol, as Roger says, you are down in London. How has the progression of this bill been for the SNP group? I mean, obviously, you've been objecting strenuously at every opportunity. Has there been any hint at all from the government that they plan to listen?
None whatsoever. I mean, I can expand on that, but it's hard to overestimate the arrogance of this Tory government. They're like a beast unleashed at the moment. They don't care. They will continue. It doesn't matter how reasonable the amendments are that are put forward or arguments that are put forward. They are dismissed without consideration at all. And it's also notable if you think of some of the sort of more moderate Tories, if there is such a thing, but if you think of some of the more moderate Tories, people like Anna Soubry, Ken Clarke, Dominic Grieve, these people have all gone. They saw the writing on the wall and what this government was going to be. So they've gone, and what we've got instead is not even a shift to the right. We've got a gigantic leap to the right with this government, and certainly the considerations of Scotland and the devolved administrations are not high on their list of priorities at all.
And so, what is the strategy now for the Westminster group, at least, in how to keep fighting this? Is there anything that you can do at this stage to slow down or stop the passage of this bill?
No, I mean, the time frame that the bill has to go through is pretty much set, and there's little you can do to slow that down. What you can keep doing is do what we do as opposition MPs, which is question and scrutinise and highlight and draw attention to. And I think what Roger, businesses and different organisations starting to take note of what's happening, I think that's partly as a result of these things being highlighted, partly as a result of the bill itself, but partly as a result of these things being continuously highlighted. And I certainly know from correspondence I've had that there is a definite shift amongst the general public as well. People that wouldn't normally be particularly political are looking at sorry, this is a step too far, that we can't support this anymore. The other thing just to say about the Tories is that the lines are the same every time whenever we raise issues. It's the strength of the union, the arm of the union, looking after us and taking of us. These lines aren't washing anymore. People are seeing it for what it is.
Mm-hmm. And Roger, just to come back to you for a moment, we saw Douglas Ross the other day say that there was almost a lack of care about Scotland and about the Union amongst some of the Tories running Britain just now. I wonder, do you think that's part of the problem? Is that the idea of the UK has become increasingly just this English nationalist Brexit project?
Yes. Well, the first thing I would say, Kenny, and to your listeners, is that the sound at my end is cutting in and out a wee bit. But
Okay.
I think I caught the gist of what you were saying. The first thing I would say is I think the way in which you expressed it in terms of a very, very narrow retrograde type of English nationalism has gripped the majority of the Tory party is quite correct. Indeed, if I go back to Carol's remarks, the change from the last general election has meant that a lot of what you would have called old style conservatives have almost entirely been swayed. And what you've got is a type of Toryism in Wales that would have been unrecognisable 20 years ago. So we're facing a very different beast entirely. And this very different beast is showing no regard whatsoever to any of the devolved institutions, really, and to Scotland in particular. So this presents us as a movement and as a party with a major challenge. If the rules of the game are changing, we've got to consider how best we respond to the new circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, even if this does make the case for an independence referendum unanswerable, even if it does swing a majority of support, it's still going to hit Scotland, and the effects are not necessarily going to be avoidable for some period. How big a risk is that to Scotland, do you think, Roger?
I think it's a colossal risk. Just a matter of maybe a month or so ago, I put an international logistics expert in touch with Mike Russell, and I know that Mike was very grateful for that. And this international logistic expert said that what is going to happen, regardless of whether there's a so-called deal or not, is worse than the worst case scenario that was developed just a year ago. The situation is going to hit people, regardless now of whether there is a cobbled together some agreement. And it's going to hit people in terms of everything from the supply of basic foodstuffs to wider services and the like. Now, it will happen at rates. Some things won't be affected immediately, but there is going to be long-run effects from this that is going to both cope with but unwind in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, we will move on now to our next story, and plans have been announced for higher and advanced higher exams to go ahead in 2021, while National 5 exams will be replaced by a system where grades are awarded based on coursework and teacher judgment. It means the volume of exams that will take place will be reduced by about half, lowering public health risks and allowing plans for higher and advanced hires to proceed. In a statement to Parliament, Deputy First Minister John Swinney said the ongoing uncertainty caused by the pandemic, combined with the fact that pupils have already lost significant study time as a result of the lockdown last year, meant that the normal exam plans were simply not possible. Replacing the National 5 exams makes space in the timetable to push the higher and advanced higher exams back until May, making up some of the lost learning time. These exams will now begin on the 13th of May, around 2 weeks later than usual. A clear contingency plan will, however, be put in place in case it proves impossible for higher and advanced higher exams to go ahead due to public health advice. So, Carol, I'll come to you first on this one. Is this the right decision from John Swinney?
Yeah, I think it is. It's difficult always to make a call like this. This is young people's futures that we're talking about here, and it's so difficult. Whatever John Swinney does is going to be criticised, and of course he would be weighing up over the last few weeks the pros and cons of any move. People are talking about, for the hires and advanced hires, the amount of learning that's been lost. I just want to be clear about that. Actually, there wasn't that much learning for that particular group lost. And what I mean by that is, when we went into lockdown towards the end of March, courses were nearly complete at that point. So it would have been revisions, activities going on, it would have been the exam diet itself. Where schools lost time was in the month of June, and that's when the youngsters would have been coming back after exams, getting into class, getting started, learning, maybe getting a unit completed, something like that. So that's where the time was lost. So I think some people are thinking there's been 6 months of education lost, and there hasn't actually. That said, it's important that we kind of get up to speed as quickly as possible. I think the worst case scenario would be if we did go ahead with hires and advanced hires. We know that university entry and sort of future job or training opportunities are often dependent on these exams. So I think it's important that we do prioritise these. National 5, of course, would have bigger cohorts sitting them, and they do have a lot of internal assessment that can be used to predict grades. So actually, I think it probably is the correct course of action. What it means for teachers, of course, is that their internal assessment takes on a whole new significance. So it's going to be a tough old year for teachers in terms of the National 5s, making sure that as accurate a picture as possible. And I think youngsters are going to feel it in terms of the amount of internal assessment, because no doubt come sort of awards, the SQA will be looking for evidence of grades. I was surprised that that was never used in this year's exam predictions. The SQA weren't checking predicted grades. That would have been an obvious thing for me. So I reckon this year, if we're going with teacher estimates for the National 5s, I reckon the SQA will be checking and making sure that there is evidence to back that up. So I think it's the best course of action given what we're dealing with at the moment.
Sure. And Roger, the Greens have said that the Scottish Government should cancel all the exams. There have been education campaigners saying that, exams are not the best way to measure kids' performance anyway. Do you think this could be part of a shift towards a model of more continuous assessment and less focus on these big exams at the end of the year?
Well, I certainly think there's a case. I mean, I made it myself years ago. I certainly think there's a case for reviewing the kind of assessment that's used right across the piece in terms of Scottish education. That, however, is a long-run job, and I wouldn't want to make that kind of decision because of the particular crisis we're in at the moment. I think that's a longer-term discussion about what kind of assessment process we need for the modern world, given the modern educational challenges that are faced. I think under the circumstances, I agree with Carol. I think John Swinney has done the right thing. I hope what is happening in addition to that is 2 things. One, that there is a serious effort to run through a number of scenarios, if it's not going to be possible, to have them with only the 2-week delay till the higher exam diet starts. And, for example, if the case was made where there had to be a 2 or 3 week delay, you then get into questions where there would need to be major negotiations and agreement with the union, looking at what the implications might be for vacation periods and the like. So depending upon how this progresses, there will have to be a lot of thinking done in that regard. Secondly, I've always had a bit of a concern about the capability of the SQA to respond quickly to unusual events. And so what I hope is also happening behind the scenes is that there is a proper review of resourcing and capability to be able to operate in a more fleet of foot way than the SQA have been able to do in the past.
Well, we'll have to just keep our eyes open for
Could
the... Sorry, go on, Carol.
Sorry to interrupt you. If I could just
Go ahead.
add to that. One of the things I heard a lot about whenever we had the results published in August was, why don't we move to continuous assessment? It's much fairer. It's a much fairer system. And as Roger says, that well, we need to be clear what we mean by that. Are we meaning class tests, or are we meaning things like project work? Because in class tests, we know that youngsters potentially can do quite well, whereas they may struggle with the huge amount that's presented in a national exam, national 5 or higher exam. The difficulty is that one of the things that's talked about with continual assessment is this coursework idea. And coursework's brilliant, and it has so many different sort of positives in terms of research, in terms of developing ideas. But we have to bear in mind that some youngsters will have a different type of support at home than others. Others might struggle with connectivity. They might have they might be living in challenging households. So it's not fair to say that, or it's not true to say that a coursework assessment gets rid of all the disparities that we deal with in an education system. So I think we need to be clear about that, because I heard a lot of people back in August talking about, oh, we should move to coursework. We need to be very careful, because those from disadvantaged backgrounds won't necessarily come out brilliantly in that scenario.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
We will move on now, though, and a damning new survey has found that the overwhelming majority of Scottish people, including Tory voters, are opposed to Boris Johnson's plans for a race to the bottom in food standards that will allow chlorinated chicken and hormone-injected beef to flood Scottish shops and supermarkets post-Brexit. The research, published by consumer group Which, revealed that 96% of respondents living in Scotland said it is important that existing standards are maintained. Around 4 in 5 said they'd be uncomfortable eating chlorinated chicken, while nearly 9 in 10 said they'd be uncomfortable eating hormone-treated beef. A staggering 95% of respondents in Scotland who voted for the Tories in the 2019 general election backed calls for food standards to be maintained, and around 3/4 stated they were uneasy that the Tory government has not ruled out lifting the bans on chlorinated chicken or hormone-treated beef. Roger, this is one of those issues that has been kind of flowing through the internal market bill and the talk about a trade deal with the US. Once again, seeing these huge majorities of Tory voters opposed to policies that the Tory government is carrying out, it's puzzling why the government is taking some of the actions it is, isn't
it? In one sense, yes, it's puzzling, unless you try and get inside the head of Boris Johnson and some of his cohorts, who I think basically don't like regulation very much at all, don't like standards. Their conception is effectively of some kind of free-for-all, right, with comparatively little controls. That suits their sort of ideological view of the world. If I can plug today, published in the iScot magazine, I've got a rather large essay on international trade. And the thing that concerns me is that a lot of research that my company, Momentous Change, has done recently into the views of Scotland and business and trade from overseas is that Scotland at the moment is seen as a place that, with good standards, is seen as a place that's highly ethical in comparison with a number of other countries. And therefore there is scope, and indeed there's international encouragement, that Scotland should frame its offering in terms of a place of the highest of standards, not the lowest. That is where we will have our place in the marketplace, which I think is a good thing. So part of the problem here for me is that a lowering of standards puts at risk not just people who are having to cope with chlorinated chicken, it's actually putting at risk the whole perception of Scotland and how Scotland should be viewed in international trade terms. We should be in the forefront of increasing standards, not of lowering standards.
Well, speaking of Brexit, we have another story, and Boris Johnson is prepared to make a major compromise to secure security ties with the EU by pledging in a deal on the future relationship not to rip up the Human Rights Act. The UK is said by EU sources to be moving in negotiations on the issue in Brussels, after previously insisting that the government would not tie its hands in any agreement on the future relationship. While welcomed by EU negotiators as unlocking progress in the security talks, the move risks angering senior backbenchers in the Tory party, including within the powerful ERG, whose former chairman, the Cabinet Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg, has been an outspoken critic of the Human Rights Act, voting to repeal it in 2012 and 2016. EU negotiators have insisted on a commitment to human rights before negotiations on security cooperation can move forward. The UK's chief negotiator, David Frost, has said that it would be an infringement of the country's sovereign independence to write in such a commitment to a deal. But EU sources have said a compromise was now in play under which the trade and security deal would include a commitment by the government not to materially alter the spirit of the Human Rights Act. Either party would then have the right to suspend or terminate the agreement if there were serious concerns about the protection of fundamental rights and the rule of law. Now, Carol, for the last few years, I mean, certainly we said there, going back as far as 2012, the Tories have tried to repeal the Human Rights Act. We saw Theresa May bang on about this several times, and we've seen Priti Patel follow that up and again attack the Human Rights Act as somehow interfering with Britain's right to do as it pleases. Are you hopeful that Britain is serious here about making a real commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights in order to secure security cooperation with the EU?
No.
You're good at these short answers, Carol.
Well, I mean, listen, they've said they're willing to break international law. They're U-turning all over the place. They say one thing one day and another thing another day. How can we trust them? You know, there's no credibility left with this government. And now we're expected to suddenly believe that they want to support the Human Rights Act. I mean, as you've already said in your introduction, that they've been trying to get rid of this for nearly a decade now. And now suddenly we're supposed to believe that they've now had a change of heart and they're going to have a commitment towards human rights. I mean, it's laughable. You've got to ask two questions. First of all, why do they want to get rid, or why do they not want to support the Human Rights Act? And secondly, are they serious about actually going through with this, or are they serious about now suddenly deciding that, yeah, okay, we can sign up to it? I mean, I'm just kind of at the point where I don't believe what they say. I don't believe their rhetoric doesn't match the actions that they take. So, yeah, I think, you know, we keep calling it out and we'll keep watching.
Well, we move now to the other side of the Atlantic, where Vice President Mike Pence and Democratic Vice Presidential nominee Kamala Harris are set to face off this evening in their only debate, as President Donald Trump's coronavirus diagnosis and the pandemic continue to roil the US presidential election. The encounter, taking place in Salt Lake City, Utah, comes after the Republican president announced last Friday that he had tested positive for the coronavirus amid an outbreak in the White House. Former Vice President Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential nominee, is leading Trump in national polls, including an average of 12 percentage points in the latest Reuters Ipsos survey of likely voters, with less than 4 weeks until the November 3rd election. Polls show that the race is closer in some of the election battleground states that could determine the winner. The two campaigns have squabbled over installing barriers on stage between Pence and Harris to guard against infection. Earlier today, television images of the debate stage showed two plexiglass barriers, one adjoining each lectern. Roger, I think I'll come to you first on this. Are you looking forward to seeing Mike Pence and Kamala Harris scrapping on stage tonight?
Well, I hate to say this, but yes, ever since I was a wee boy, I was fascinated by watching debates, sometimes recorded in old black and white TV set my mum and dad had. So yes, so I'll be there. I don't have high expectations for it, I have to say. And it strikes me there's been, well, with the exception, of course, of Obama, who I thought was a masterly debater, but on the whole, the debates over the last 10 or 15 years, I don't think have quite been as interesting as the debates in previous times. But I think this is going to be important. I think the only thing that the Democrats need to do is not shoot themselves in the foot. And I don't think they have much worries about that. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Do I think it's going to change anything very much? No.
And Carol, Kamala Harris is only the third woman to take part in any presidential election, at least in the Democrat and Republican parties. Only the second African American, the first Asian American. Do you think, how much do you think any of that kind of thing matters as far as the voters go?
As far as the voters go, there's probably that's one issue, but I think it matters greatly in terms of representation and in terms of role models and in terms of actually putting forward a different type of person to what we usually see, which is white, stale and pale, or grey-haired and nay-haired, as my husband would refer to them. His is grey, not nay. So I think it will matter. I think voters are keen to see what she can actually say and how she comes across, because we haven't seen an awful lot of Kamala Harris. So I think this is her big sort of showpiece now. So it is quite important in terms of her up in her profile. Let's take Biden and Trump out of it, and let's see what happens. I'm really excited about seeing her tonight and seeing how she copes with a character such as Pence. But I think she should have this in the bag. As Roger says, I think it should be a straightforward one for her tonight. But yeah, it'll be interesting. What time is it at, by the way, Kenny?
I think it starts at about 1 a.m. our time. I'm not 100% sure. Just then, quite quickly, Joe Biden has talked about potentially only serving for one term, which would put Kamala Harris in pole position to become the next president. From what you have seen of her so far, do you think that that's the right way for America to be heading?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting whenever there was the contest between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and I think that was kind of 2007, 2008 time. It was reckoned that America was not ready for a female president, or it was more ready for a black president than a female president. And which is good in one respect, but in the other respect, you've got to say that tells you an awful lot about America, or probably about politics generally worldwide. So it'll be interesting. I think I don't want to kind of talk away the next 4 years. There's an election first, and the Democrats then, should they be successful, and it's looking as though they will be, but then have to kind of perform in those 4 years in order for her potentially to step into his shoes. But I think she's quite an exciting prospect. So it'd be really, I mean, it really would be momentous, not just to have an African-American president once again, but also to have a female president. And in terms of female representation, that is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we move on now, and two members of an alleged people smuggling gang stood trial today, accused of being responsible for the deaths of 39 Vietnamese men, women, and boys found suffocated in a stifling airtight shipping container near London last year. The victims, 9 of whom were teenagers and 2 aged just 15, were discovered last October in a container at the back of a truck on an industrial estate in Grays, about 20 miles east of London. A shocking incident which shone a light on global people smuggling. Prosecutor William Emlyn Jones said the dead had been sealed inside a refrigeration unit, which was not turned on, in pitch black for at least 12 hours, as the temperature rose to an unbearable 38.5 degrees Celsius. Roger, we reported on this back when it happened. I mean, a really just horrifying incident that showed some of the dangers that people face in the public people smuggling world. Do you think this is going to help change things at all?
Unfortunately, I don't think it will make any impact, because where the change needs to happen is in many of the devastated lands across the world where refugees by the million are being created, if I want to put it that way. I do a lot of work for the company that I chair that looks at the humanitarian consequences of the impact of explosive devices. That throughout the world, there are huge numbers of refugees who have been devastated by conflict that is unimaginable to the people streets of Scotland. You need to go out and really see this to fully understand the circumstances they live in. So I've got every sympathy for refugees trying to escape the devastation of many of the homelands in this world. The problem for me is that the international community as a whole is wholly failing the innocence of this world. The number of people dying as refugees is far greater than are dying in some of the wars that we're willing to spend billions in weapons on. Yet we are unable to spend even a fraction of that money in trying to secure a peaceful and safe place for completely innocent people, often young, often who've lost loved ones. So I think this is one of the major failures of the international community.
And Carol, we know we've talked at length about the UK's hostility to migrants. What do you think Scotland could do differently in terms of attacking the people smuggling business?
Well, I think first of all, I mean, it's important to say that Scotland does look differently on this. Scotland is a country that's open and welcoming. The same can't be said for parts of the rest of the UK. So there is a distinction there right away, and there are many reasons for that. And I would go into lots of them just now, but there are many reasons for that. The difficulty is that immigration is still reserved to Westminster, and I know that during the time of the worst atrocities of the conflict in Syria, people were getting in touch with me saying, we'll take refugees, we've got a spare room, we can put people up. But the difficulty is when the UK government has the key to unlock the door to allow people in, and they won't do that. It's an impossible situation that we're in. Scotland has taken a much larger share of refugees than other parts of the UK already. So, I mean, the Scottish government, the Scottish people, the local communities are ready and willing, but we need the powers over immigration devolved to the Scottish Parliament so that we can let these people come. In terms of what's happened with the tragic events of last year with those 39 people, and you started by asking, will this change anything? I think the stakes are far too high, and the stakes are too high for the smugglers themselves. They make so much money out of that. I mean, that was probably worth £1 million to them by the time each of those individuals or their families and paid for their transport. It's worth a huge amount of money given that so easily. The stakes are also high for those seeking refuge as well. When you're fleeing from either persecution or war or conflict, then you're willing to take risks, and we have to recognise that. I remember when the wee boy Alan Kurdi, when we saw the images of him dead on the beach, suddenly the rhetoric changed. Suddenly we had, instead of the whatever paper, the sort of migrants, there was a change in the rhetoric, and it's unfortunate that it needs like this in order to see any sort of real change in public opinion. But I think Scotland is quite different from other parts of the UK in that.
Well, just before we move on, Carol, one of our viewers has tweeted in saying that the debate starts at 2 a.m. our time. So if you're wanting to stay up for it, there you go. We move on now. We move on now, though. And a campaign which urges Scots who witness hate crime to report it to stop it is relaunched today ahead of Hate Crime Awareness Week. The initiative features a series of letters from Scotland addressed to perpetrators of hate crime, describing the impact it has on its victim, stating that your hate has no home here. Carried on posters, radio ads and social media, the campaign is being run in partnership with Police Scotland and urges victims and witnesses of hate crime to report it. It also provides information on how to report during the pandemic. Now, Roger, this is, as it says, a relaunch of this campaign. A lot of us will remember having seen these posters around before. But another story that came up today, we didn't have time for it in the show, but in Greece, Golden Dawn, the far-right party, several of its leaders were convicted today in the largest trial of fascists since Nuremberg, apparently. It just reminds us that hate and hate speech is still a serious problem in a lot of places and does have to be taken pretty seriously, doesn't it?
Oh, I would agree 100% with what you're saying there, Kenny. Indeed, however, I would go further if I'm allowed to be slightly controversial here. I don't think it's enough to address it just in this way. I think the political community has got some responsibility to set standards itself. So that, for example, although it might not be of the scale of some of the worst hate crimes, some of the debate and the language that's used in social media where people are taking different positions is really terrible. And I don't think it's helped when there are people who are in some way connected to political parties or political movements who engage in some of this. So I think they're combined with what is being announced. I think it would be good if somebody, maybe even the SNP, was to take an initiative and to say, this is how we are going to set cultural expectations of the way in which debates should be conducted. And we are going to expect all our elected representatives, all our members, to conduct themselves in a particular way. So I think, as well as what is being proposed, I would like to see some form of initiative to frame it in a more positive light as to what should be done to make things better, not just complaining about it after it happens. Now, my idea might not be the best one, but I certainly think it would be useful to have a debate about how we improve the culture around political discourse in this country.
Well, we always have very nice conversations here on Broadcast in Scotland, so I would suggest that, people just need to start watching us. But anyway, we come now to our final story of the evening, and two scientists won the 2020 Nobel Prize in Chemistry today for creating genetic scissors that can rewrite DNA, contributing to new cancer therapies and holding out the prospect of curing hereditary diseases. Emmanuelle Charpentier, who is French, and American Jennifer Doudna share the 10 million Swedish crown prize, equivalent to almost £900,000, for developing the CRISPR/Cas9 tool to edit the DNA of animals, plants, and microorganisms with precision. The ability to cut the DNA where you want has revolutionized the life sciences, Pernilla Witung, staff's head of the Swedish Academy of Sciences, told an award ceremony. Charpentier and Doudna became the 6th and 7th women to win Nobel Prizes for Chemistry, joining Marie Curie, who won in 1911, and more recently Frances Arnold in 2018. It is the first time since 1964, when Britain's Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin alone won the award, that no men are among the Chemistry Prize winners. This is pretty positive news for women in science, isn't it? Carol, sorry.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's a really great story, and it, you just want to say, go for it, girls. That's fantastic. The important point though is it's quite it. There's been all sorts of studies done about the difficulties that females have in science, about the difficulties to be taken seriously by their male counterparts, and actually get research papers published, get funding for their projects, all of these kind of things. So it's actually it's such a good story. It's a positive story, but it's not just positive for the two women involved. It's actually really positive for women in science collectively. So brilliant news.
Yeah, and I mean, there is a long history of women kind of not getting credit for work that they've done, the credit going to the more senior man in the team. Do you think that's something that is starting to change now?
I'd like to say yes to that, but I think we've got a long way to go. I mean, you talked about women not getting credit. The famous one, of course, was Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who discovered pulsars, stars, and it was her supervisor that got the credit for that. So, but she's quite I suppose pensive about it, and says, well, actually, if I had got the prize, probably it wouldn't have been as big a story, but because I didn't get the prize, it's highlighted the inequalities better, and it's allowed me to kind of get my work out more than I would have done otherwise. So she actually thinks that there are positives that have come as a result of her not getting the prize. But I would say, I mean, looking at the challenges faced by women in science, I think we've got a long way still to go. I've got two daughters. They're both really kind of scientifically minded, but when they were born, it was as though somebody had vomited pink all over my house. All the presents, the cards, the clothes, everything was pink. We're putting stereotypes onto our girls at that point of birth. So it's an uphill struggle, and we've got a long way still to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to talk about that because we are very, very nearly out of time. I would like to thank Carol Monaghan and Roger Mullen for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to both of you. And thank you to you at home for joining us as well. There would be no point at all in producing the shows if we didn't have you joining us. We do have to ask, if you're able to support us here at Broadcasting Scotland, that you do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month helps us, first of all, to keep the lights on here at Broadcasting Scotland, but also to keep building the better broadcaster that Scotland deserves. If you're not able to support us financially, we absolutely understand, and the shows will always be free to view online, but you can still make a big difference for us. You can follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot. You can like our Facebook page. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon while you're there. And all of that helps us attract more attention, but more importantly, it lets you spread the word. Your word of mouth is the biggest selling point we can have for Broadcasting Scotland. So please do let your friends and family know why you watch Broadcasting Scotland and why you think they should too. And finally, we always need new people here to help out. There's lots of opportunities here at Broadcasting Scotland, whether you want to work in front of the camera or behind it. So if you've got any interest in helping us build that better broadcaster for Scotland, then do please give us a shout. We would love to hear from you. That is absolutely all we have time for tonight, though. So once again, thank you to Carol and to Roger. Thank you at home for joining us again. And Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7 with another Scotland at 7. I'll be back on Friday with another special show. But until then, thanks for joining us and have a great evening. Good night.